Have you ever wondered what happens when a land is marked by so much blood that even death cannot erase scars? Have you ever wondered if the ghosts of an entire civilization can remain stuck between two worlds, haunting forever those who dare to step on sacred soil? And if I told you that there is a place in the heart of Texas where time seems to have not passed, where echoes of war shouts still resonate through the hills, and where travelers disappeared without a trail? My name is Sam Houston, and during my years as governor of Tennessee and then as a leader in the formation of the Republic of Texas, I witnessed things that official history never recorded. I walked through lands where the blood of warriors still calls for revenge, where whole tribes were decimated and their souls never found rest. Today, I will tell you about one of the darkest secrets I carry, the story of the ghost tribe of Balcones, hills in New Braunfels. A story that few know, but will forever change the way you see these seemingly peaceful lands. Get ready, because what you are about to listen will challenge everything you think you know about the Texas border. It was the fall of 1838 when I received the first letter. I was in Washington under the shaft, dealing with the endless challenges of the newly graduated Texas Republic, when a mail came with a message that would change everything. The letter came from Johann Friedrich Grune, one of the first German settlers who had settled in the region we call New Braunfels today. Grune was a practical man of a few words, but his writing trembled with genuine fear. "General Houston," said the letter, "I need your help. Something terrible is happening in our lands. My men are disappearing. Children talk to people we can't see. And at night, Lord, at night we hear drums of war that make our blood freeze." Grune described how her family had settled close to what the local natives called Eternal Lament Hills, a name that should have served as a warning. They built their homes in the valley, near the river that serpents among the rock elevations characteristic of the hill country region. At first it seemed perfect. The earth was fertile, abundant water, and the Germans worked hard to build a new life. But soon, the strangeness started. First were the animals. The cattle refused to graze in certain areas of the hills, even with the greener grass that could be imagined. The horses pranced and reconnected with terror as they approached certain points of the property. The dogs howled all night, staring at the rock elevations. Then came the disappearances. Heinrich Müller, one of Grune's most reliable workers, left a morning to check the fences in the northern part of the property. It has never been seen again. They found only their tools scattered near a rock formation that the place is called the Portal of the Dead. A week later, it was the turn of two brothers, Klaus and Wilhelm Schmidt. They left at dawn to hunt deer in the hills and simply faded. Search groups were organized, but did not even find footprints beyond a certain point on the trails. But the most disturbing were the children's reports. Little Emma Grune, then only 6, began talking about her. Friends of the hills, he described with impressive warriors painted warriors with war. Colored warriors who told her stories about great battles and asked her to bring food and water to them. "They are hungry, Dad," said the girl. "They have been hungry for a long, long time." The parents initially thought it was a childish imagination, until Emma began to draw the faces of these friends. The drawings showed distinctly American facial characteristics, with war paintings that followed specific patterns of region tribes. What scared was that Emma had never seen a Native American in her life. The family had arrived directly from Germany and settled on the isolated property. That's when Grune decided to write me. He knew of my experience with native tribes and hoped that I could explain what was going on. I left for New Braunfels 3 days after receiving the letter, accompanied only from my faithful squire, a Cherokee named Branca Eagle, who had been my guide and translator during years of negotiations with several tribes. The trip took 4 days riding through the still savage territory of the center of Texas. As we approached the Balcones Hills region, White Eagle became more and more restless. "This land cries, General," he said the third night as we ended under a starry sky. "I can feel the weight of the dead." I asked what he meant, but he just shook his head and refused to elaborate. That night we both sleep badly. Strange dreams visited us. Visions of great battles, warriors falling into a shower of arrows, women and children running into panic through rocky hills. On the 4th day, we arrived at Grune's property. The man was waiting for us on the porch of his stone house, and I could immediately see that the weeks of terror had charged their price. Her hair had closed prematurely, and deep dark circles surrounded her eyes. "General Houston," he said, squeezing my hand with desperate strength. "Thank God the Lord has come. Things have worsened since I wrote." Gruene told us that 3 more men had disappeared the week before. This time, one of the wives had secretly followed her husband when he went out to work, worried about his safety. "My Greta sister-in-law saw it all," said Gruene, her voice shaking. "Heinrich was working near the rocks when figures began to emerge from their own stones. Warriors, General. Ghost warriors. According to Greta's account, the spirits surrounded Heinrich silently. He seemed to be in a trance, not reacting to the approach. Then he simply walked with them toward the hills and disappeared between the rock formations. She tried to scream, but no sound came out of her throat," continued Gruene. "And when it finally managed to move, there was nothing more there. Neither Heinrich nor the others." I asked to talk to Greta. The woman was in a state of deep shock, babbling in German and refusing to look toward the hills. But when White Eagle approached and began to speak in her native tongue, she suddenly was alert. "She understands," said White Eagle, surprised. "I don't know how, but she understands what I'm saying." It was then that Greta, in broken English, told us something that made my blood freeze. "The spirits, they spoke to me. They said that this land is theirs, that we're betrayed and massacred here for a long time. They will not rest until justice is done." That night we installed our camp near the rock formations where the disappearances had occurred. Against all the protests of Gruene and her family, we decided to spend the night there to see what could happen. At midnight, the drums started. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. They were war drums, that was right. But they carried a supernatural quality that made the bones vibrate and the heart accelerate involuntarily. White Eagle got up immediately, his sharp instincts after years living on the border. "General," he whispered, "these are not living drums." We remain real estate, just listening. The rhythm was complex, following standards that I recognized from my experiences with various tribes. It was a rhythm of lament, of anger, from call to war. Then came the voices. They started as whispers in the wind, but gradually became more distinct. They were chants in native tongues that I couldn't completely identify, but White Eagle was pale as he heard them. "They are telling a story," he said, his voice badly passing from a whisper. "A story of betrayal and death." As the songs continued, White Eagle began to translate fragments. "We came in peace. We offer sacred smoke." The words were sweet, like honey, but the hearts were bitter as a chicuta. The voices intensified, and it suddenly could see figures moving between the rocks. They were not solid, but translucent, as if they were made of moonlight and shadows. Warriors, women, children, an entire tribe of spirits walking among rock formations. They talked about land to everyone, of peace between red and white brothers. But they brought death. They brought fire. It was then that I understood. Those hills had been the scene of a massacre, not just a battle, but a deliberate extermination of an entire tribe. White Eagle continued translating, and the full story unfolded before us. Decades before the arrival of the German settlers, a Tonkawa tribe had settled in that region. They were a peaceful people, known for their ability to work stone and their sacred rituals made in natural rock formations. In 1821, a group of Anglo-American traders arrived in the region, claiming to look for commercial routes to the south. The chief of the tribe, a man named Heart of Stone, received them with honors, offering hospitality and protection. Traders remained during the winter, apparently establishing friendly relationships with the tribe. They talked about trade opportunities, how whites and Indians could thrive together in the region. But everything was an elaborate lie. In the spring of 1822, traders departed, claiming to look for more goods to market. They returned 3 months later, but not alone. They brought with them an irregular military force of more than 100 men, all armed and determined to take the lands of the tribe. What followed was not a battle. It was a cold and calculated massacre. The Tonkawa were caught completely unprepared. The attackers arrived during the sacred ceremony of the full moon, when the whole tribe gathered in rock formations for their ancestral rituals. Men, women, children, and elders were gathered in a circle, singing and dancing when the shots began. There was no honor, there was no war, only death from the shadows. Translated White Eagle, tears running down his face. The tribe tried to defend itself, but was in clear numerical and weaponry disadvantage. The warriors fought boldly, but were quickly overcome. The women tried to protect the children, running away from the rocky trails, but were persecuted and slaughtered. In a single night, the whole tribe was exterminated. More than 200 souls were repelled in those hills. But atrocity did not stop there. The strikers looted all that had value, burned the tents and the sacred objects, and threw the bodies in a nearby natural cave, sealing the entrance with stones. There were no funeral rituals. There was no respect for the dead. Only the desire to erase any evidence of what had happened. Our souls were trapped, between life and death, without rest, no peace. The spectral songs continued. The story has never been officially recorded. The traders spread rumors that the tribe had migrated south, and as few knew the existence of Tonkawa in that specific region, no one questioned their version. The lands were abandoned for decades, avoided even by other tribes who could feel the presence of the restless dead. Only with the arrival of the German settlers, who were completely unaware of the history of the place, did someone settle there again. As the spirits continued their regret, I understood why the settlers were disappearing. The ghost tribe did not see them as individuals, saw only invaders, people who were once again taking their sacred lands. "General," said White Eagle, grabbing my arm, "they want justice. They want the world to know what happened here." That's when a figure stood out from the others. He was a tall warrior, with a scar that crossed the left side of his face. He approached our camp until just a few meters away. When he spoke, his voice echoed directly in our minds. "White man who walks with red brother. Do you know the words? Of the two peoples. Can you carry our story to the living world?" I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the responsibility that was being placed on my shoulders. "Then listen well," continued the spirit. "Listen and never forget. What the spirit of the Heart of Stone told me that night changed forever my understanding of the colonization of Texas. They were not just stories of war and conquest. They were revelations about systematic betrayals, hidden massacres, and injustices that cried out of recognition. Heart of Stone showed me visions of what really happened that fateful night of 1822. I saw through his eyes the terror of the children, the despair of mothers, the powerless fury of the warriors. I saw men who claimed to be civilized by committing acts of barbarism that would even make the wildest among us retreat with horror. "Our children cried for their mothers until their voices shut up forever," he said, and I could see spectral tears running down his translucent face. "Our elders, who carried the wisdom of generations, were slaughtered as animals. Our sacred history, kept in our hearts for centuries, died with us." But there was more. Heart of Stone revealed to me that the Tonkawa massacre was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader standard, a deliberate campaign to eliminate smaller tribes that occupied lands desired by the settlers. "We were only the first," he said. "Others followed our destiny. Other tribes were erased from the face of the earth, their lost stories as if they had never existed." He showed me visions of other massacres, other betrayals. I saw whole families of Karankawa being poisoned at parties of peace. I saw Cherokee villages being burned during the winter, forcing survivors to die of cold and hunger. I saw treated being signed with one hand, while the other wielded the sword of betrayal. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Although I already knew the answer. "Because you have the power of words, Sam Houston. You can tell those who govern. It can make our truth heard." The weight of this responsibility was overwhelming. I knew that revealing this information could shake the foundations of the Republic of Texas. Many of the men responsible for these massacres were still alive, some occupying positions of power and influence. But there was something more urgent, to be resolved: the fate of the German settlers who kept disappearing. "What do you want from the Germans?" I asked. They didn't know about the history of this land. They came in search of a new life, just as you once did. Heart of Stone was silent for a long moment. looking at the rock formations where his tribe had been massacred. "They are not the ones we sought," I said finally. "But as long as our history remains buried, as long as our dead are not honored, our anger will spread as a poison on earth. We cannot control the darkness that our pain has created." It was then that I understood the true nature of the problem. The massacre had left a spiritual wound on the earth itself. The anger and suffering of the dead Tonkawa had impregnated in the ground, creating a kind of curse that affected everyone who tried to settle there. "Is there a way to break this curse?" I asked. Stoneheart nodded slowly. "3 things must be done. First, the truth must be told. The world must know what happened here. Second, our dead must be honored with proper rituals. And third—" He hesitated. "Third?" I insisted. "Those responsible for the massacre must face justice. While those who spilled innocent blood walk free through the earth, our souls will find no rest." I felt a shiver through my spine. Some of the men responsible for the massacre were still alive, and several of them had become prominent figures in Texan politics. To confront them would be like opening a Pandora box that could destroy careers, reputations, and even the political stability of the young republic. But I knew what was the right choice to make. In the weeks that followed me to meet the spirits, I began a discreet investigation into the events of 1822. I used my military and political contacts to access old records, private correspondences, and testimonies of ancient borders. What I discovered confirmed all the visions that Heart of Stone had shown me. I found letters among traders planning the massacre, Tonkawa land sales records shortly after the tribe's extermination, and even confessions in deathbeds of some of the participants. One of the most incriminating documents was a letter from Jacob Morrison, one of the leaders of the massacre, for his brother in the East. "The work is done," said the letter, dated June 1822. "The Indians have been permanently removed, and the lands are now ours to colonize. There were no witnesses, and we take care that they would not remain evidence. As you said, sometimes it is necessary to dirty hands to build civilization." Morrison was still alive when I found this letter. He had become a prosperous rancher and held an important position in the territorial government. Confronting him would be one of the most difficult decisions of my political career. But before taking any action, I needed to return to the Balcones hills to fulfill my promise to the Heart of Stone. I returned to New Braunfels accompanied by White Eagle and a Cherokee shaman named Grey Wolf, a specialist in spiritual purification rituals. It also brought supplies to a suitable funeral ritual: sacred tobacco, eagle feathers, ceremonial stones, and other items necessary to honor the dead Tonkawa. Gruin and the other German settlers welcomed us with hope mixed with skepticism. The disappearances had temporarily stopped after my first visit, but the community tension was palpable. "General," said Gruin, "my children still talk to the spirits. My little Emma draws warriors every night. What did you find out?" I told him, and the other settlers the true history of the Balcones Hills. His reactions ranged from horror to unbelief, but when I showed some of the documents he had collected, the doubt became a dark understanding. "Then we built our homes on a cemetery," said Wilhelm Mueller, one of the oldest settlers. "No wonder. The dead are restless." That night we performed the funeral ritual for the Tonkawa massacred. Grey Wolf led the traditional Cherokee ceremonies, adapted to honor a tribe that had lost their own shamans before rituals could be performed. We lit sacred bonfires in rock formations where the tribe had been attacked. We burned tobacco and sacred herbs, offering prayers so that the souls of the dead would find their way to the world of spirits. We singed and farewell songs, allowing the Tonkawa to finally perform their final journey. Throughout the ritual, the spirits were present. We could see them gathering around the bonfires, their translucent forms gradually becoming brighter and more peaceful. Stoneheart was in the center, his eyes finally losing the anger he had consumed for decades. When the ritual came to an end, he approached me one last time. "Thank you, Sam Houston," he said. "Now our souls can rest. But remember your promise. The truth must be told, and justice must be done." With these words, he and all the other spirits faded, leaving only a sense of peace that had not existed in those lands for decades. Keeping the promise I made, the Heart of Stone proved to be more complex and dangerous than I had imagined. Revealing the truth about the Tonkawa massacre meant confronting some of Texas's most powerful men, and the consequences of this revelation would extend far beyond what I had anticipated. My first action was formally documenting everything I had discovered. I compiled all the documents, testimonies, and evidence in a detailed report that I submitted to the Congress of the Republic of Texas. The report, entitled Forgotten Atrocities: The Massacre of the Balcones Hills and Other Crimes Against Native Nations, caused an immediate scandal. Jacob Morrison, now publicly identified as one of the massacre leaders, vehemently denied all accusations. His political allies mobilized to discredit my report, claiming that I was being manipulated by Wild and that my proximity to native tribes had compromised my judgment. Sam Houston lost his way, said Morrison in a public speech. He prefers to believe in fantasies of dead Indians than in the word of respectable citizens. These accusations are pure defamation based on fake superstitions and documents. But I had been careful. The evidence was too solid to easily be discarded. The letter Morrison had written to his brother was authenticated by 3 independent specialists in calligraphy. Other documents corroborated the details of the massacre, and some of the younger participants, now elderly men in their beds of death, began to confess their participation in the events. The case gained national attention when newspapers from other states began to republish excerpts from my report. "Massacre in Texas exposes pattern of atrocities," said the headline of New York Herald. "General Houston reveals covered crimes against natives. Public pressure has grown rapidly." Morrison and his allies were forced to face formal investigations, and several of them lost their political positions. Morrison was eventually tried for multiple murder, although the ancient nature of the crimes complicated the legal process. During the trial, something extraordinary happened. Greta, the German woman who had witnessed the spirits, was called to testify. When she took the stand, something changed in her expression. It was as if a different presence had taken over her. "I was there," she said, her strangely deep and resonating voice. "I saw the white men arrive in the dark. I saw the children trying to hide between the rocks. I saw this man," she pointed directly to Morrison, "shooting and disarmed women." The defense lawyer protested, claiming that Greta was clearly in a changed state and that his testimony should not be considered valid. But when she began to describe specific details of the massacre, details that were not in any public document and could only be known to someone who was present, the court was silent. She described the exact location of each body, the final words of Stoneheart, even the pattern of the war paintings that the Tonkawa used, information that was later confirmed by archaeological evidence found on site. Morrison was convicted, but due to his advanced age, received only house arrest. He died 2 years later, but not before making a complete confession about the massacre, and the followed by. "We did what we thought needed at the time," he said in his final confession. "But I carried the weight of these deaths throughout my life. Every night, I saw their faces in my dreams. There was no peace for me, just as there was no peace for them. With justice finally served and the truth revealed to the world, I returned to the Balcones Hills last time." The transformation was remarkable. The spiritual oppression that had weighed on Earth for decades had completely dissipated. The German settlers reported that paranormal phenomena had ceased. The children no longer spoke to invisible spirits, the animals no longer showed the hills, and a general sense of peace had settled over the region. Gruene welcomed me with tears in her eyes. "General," he said, "I don't know how to thank what the Lord did. For the first time since we arrived here, I feel that this land really accepts us." But perhaps the most touching moment was when little Emma approached me. The girl who once spoke constantly to spirits now seemed like a normal child, playing and laughing like any other. "Is the Friends of the Hills?" I asked her. She smiled and nodded. "They said thank you and went home. They said they can rest now, because someone finally told the truth about them." I established a memorial where the massacre had occurred, a simple stone plate with the names of all the dead Tonkawa, as we could determine them through tribal records of other nations. The memorial also included a summary of the true history of 1822 events. The revelation of the Tonkawa massacre had lasting repercussions on Texas politics. It led to investigations into other possible covert massacres and resulted in official policies reforms in relation to native tribes. Although he could not undo the injustices of the past, at least he guaranteed that they were not forgotten. Years later, when I became governor of Texas, I established an official committee to investigate and document historical crimes against Native populations. The work of this committee resulted in the official recognition of dozens of previously unknown atrocities and the creation of memorials to honor the victims. But for me, personally, the experience in the Balcones Hills was transforming in a way that goes beyond politics or social justice. She taught me that there are truths that transcend death, and that sometimes the dead can talk more clearly than the alive about what really happened in history. It also taught me that the earth itself can carry memories, that places where great injustices have been committed can retain these wounds until they are properly recognized and cured. The years that followed the resolution of the case of the Balcones Hills brought me many other experiences with the supernatural, but none was as profound as that first lesson on posthumous justice. In 1845, I received an unexpected letter from a man named Friedrich Engels, not the famous German philosopher, but a settler who had settled near New Braunfels a few years after the events I reported. Engels had bought an adjacent property to the old Tonkawa lands and wrote to tell me something extraordinary. "General Houston," said his letter, "the Lord needs to know that his work in those hills had consequences that go beyond what he imagined. Something wonderful is happening in our lands." Engels described how, in the spring following the memorial establishment, wild flowers began spontaneously around the rock formations where the massacre had occurred. They were not ordinary flowers. They were native species that did not naturally grow in that elevation, flowers that were traditionally used by Tonkawa in their sacred rituals. "It's as if the land itself is celebrating," wrote Engels. "Flowers form perfect circular patterns, exactly where the Lord said that tribal rituals were performed. Our local botanists cannot explain how these species have come here, or why they grow only in these specific points." Even more intriguing, Engels reported that other settlers in the region began to report vivid dreams in which they received instructions on agricultural techniques and land conservation methods that were clearly of American native origin. Farmers who followed these dream instructions found that their harvests were significantly more abundant than those of their neighbors. "It is as if the spirits who once haunted this land now are blessing us," concluded Engels. "As if, in exchange for having honored their memory, they were sharing with us the secrets they learned for centuries living on this earth." I decided to personally investigate these allegations. When I returned to the Balcones Hills in the spring of 1845, I was impressed with the transformation. The area around the memorial had become a lush natural garden, with vibrant color flowers growing in patterns that clearly resembled traditional Tonkawa designs. White Eagle, who accompanied me on this visit, was equally impressed. "General," he said, kneeling to play one of the flowers, "these are sacred plants of my people, but they should not grow here. The soil, the climate, the elevation, everything is wrong for them. And yet—" He paused, closing his eyes and breathing deeply. "I can feel benevolent presence here. They are no longer restless spirits. They are guardians." The Tonkawa chose to remain, not out of anger, but for the sake of the earth. That night, we camp again near the memorial. Unlike the first time, there were no war drums or terrifying visions. Instead, we experienced peaceful dreams full of harmony images between settlers and natives, sustainable agricultural techniques, and a future vision where different cultures could respectfully coexist. In the most vivid dream, I saw the heart of stone again. But this time, he was not dressed for the war. He wore ceremonial clothes of peace, and his face radiated serenity. "Sam Houston," he said, "you have fulfilled your word. Our story was told, our dead were honored, and those who harmed us have faced consequences. Now we can offer something in return." He showed me visions of the future of the Balkans, German settlers and descendants of other native tribes working together, sharing knowledge, creating a community that honored both European and Native American traditions. "This land can be an example," said Heart of Stone. "A place where past wounds are healed through mutual respect and justice. But this will only happen if the lessons we learn here are taken elsewhere." When I woke up, I found a small object that wasn't there the night before, a Tonkawa amulet made of polished stone, recorded with symbols that White Eagle identified, as representing protection for those who speak the truth. I carried this amulet with me for the rest of my life, and he accompanied me through many other situations where I had to choose between political convenience and moral justice. Whenever I hesitated about the right choice to make, I felt the weight of that small object in my pocket, remembering the lessons learned in the Balcones hills. The story of the ghost tribe had lasting effects that extended far beyond that specific region. The report I wrote about the massacre became an important historical document, cited in academic studies on the relations between settlers and natives. More importantly, it established a precedent to investigate and officially recognize historical injustices. In 1847, when Texas was attached by the United States, I worked with federal officials to establish protocols to identify and preserve places of historical significance for native tribes. The memorial in the Balcones Hills has become the model for dozens of other established memorials throughout the state. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the change in the way European settlers in the region began to relate to the native history of the earth. Many farmers have begun to research the tribal history of their properties, some even consulting surviving tribes' elders to learn traditional methods of agriculture and conservation. Little Emma Gruen, who had talked to the Tonkawa spirits as a child, grew up to become a respected ethnographic, dedicating her life to document and preserving the traditions of the towns in the center of Texas. She always said that her vocation was born from those first supernatural encounters in the Balcones Hills. "The spirits taught me that every land has a story," she wrote in her memories, published decades later, "and that we, who live on this land now, are responsible for knowing and honoring this story, even when it is painful." New Braunfels himself became known as a place of unusual racial and cultural harmony for the time. The German community developed traditions that incorporated elements of American native culture, and many colonist descendants married members of neighboring tribes. In my last years, I visited the Balcones Hills once again. It was 1863, and I was old and tired, carrying the weight of decades of leadership during some of the most turbulent periods in American history. But when I sat next to the Tonkawa Memorial, I felt the same peace I had experienced in that first purification ritual. The wildflowers still sprouted in their magical standards. The local community had grown and prospered. And most importantly, the history of the Tonkawa had become an integral part of local identity. Not something to be forgotten or denied, but something to be remembered and honored. On that final visit, I had a last date with Stoneheart. He appeared not as a spirit, but almost as a living memory of the earth, part of the very essence of the place. "You did well, old friend," he said. "The seed of justice we plant here has grown and spread. Other places, other forgotten injustices, are being brought to light because of the example we established." It was true. In the years following the Balcones Hills, other communities in Texas and beyond began to investigate their own forgotten stories. Covered old massacres were revealed, memorials were established, and families of long-forgotten victims finally received recognition and closure. "But remember," Stoneheart continued, "this work never really ends. Each generation must choose again between truth and convenience, between justice and self-interest. What you have done here is an example, but each person must decide for himself if this example will follow." Decades after these events, when I became a more reflective figure in my advanced years, I began to understand that experience in Balcones Hills had changed not only that specific place, but also my own understanding of the nature of leadership and historical responsibility. In 1860, just before the beginning of the Civil War, I received an unexpected visit at my home in Huntsville. He was a young historian named Marcus Whitman, who was researching cases of supernatural phenomena related to historical injustices. He had heard rumors about the events in the Balcones Hills and wanted to document my experience for an academic study. "General Houston," he said. His actions in that case established something unprecedented. For the first time in American history, a high-ranking officer officially recognized supernatural allegations as valid evidence of historical crimes. How did this change his perspective on leadership? The question made me reflect deeply on the decades that had happened since those events. "Young," I said, "I learned that a true leader must be willing to hear voices that others prefer to ignore, even the voices of the dead, if necessary. The story is full of inconvenient truths that have been buried with their victims. Our responsibility is not only towards the living, but also to those who can no longer talk for themselves. Whitman carefully scored my words. But certainly the Lord faced significant skepticism. How did they respond to those who questioned their sanity for believing in ghosts? I smiled when I remembered the many criticisms he had faced over the years. Let me tell something I learned, young Whitman. The difference between a wise man and a fool is not whether he believes in the supernatural or not. The difference is at his disposal to investigate the truth, regardless of how strange or inconvenient it might be. I showed him the Tonkawa amulet that still carried me. This small object constantly reminds me that there are more things between heaven and earth than our philosophy can explain. But more importantly, it reminds me that the truth has a way of emerging, even when we try to bury it. Whitman examined the amulet with fascination. Do you really believe you have been given to you for a spirit? I believe in what I saw and tried, I said. But even if you explain everything as hallucination or coincidence, the fact remains. To investigate these supernatural allegations has led to the discovery of real crimes and justice for real victims. Methods may seem unconventional, but the results speak for themselves. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger with disturbing news. Tensions about slavery were reaching a critical point, and it seemed increasingly likely that the country would divide into civil war. The young historian left soon after, but our words remained with me. That night, alone in my office, I contemplated the lessons I had learned from the Tonkawa. If a historical injustices could create so deep spiritual wounds that they literally haunted Earth for decades, what would happen to a country built on the systematic injustice of slavery? He had the feeling that the United States were about to face their own ghosts. The spirits of millions of Africans torn from their lands, from wrapped families, from generations born in captivity. And unlike Tonkawa, whose voices could be heard by a few sensitive, these spirits would speak through cannons and rifles, with bloodshed and battlefields throughout the continent. When the Civil War finally began, I saw in it echoes of history that had discovered in the Balcones hills. It was another historical account being charged, another case of injustices ignored for so long that they finally exploded in catastrophic violence. During the war years, I often thought of parallels between the Tonkawa massacre and the broader experience of American slavery. Both involved the systematic dehumanization of integer groups of people. Both were justified by those in power as necessary for progress. And both left wounds that could not be healed simply by ignoring them. After the war, when the nation struggled to rebuild, I wrote a series of letters to political leaders, installing them to apply the lessons we had learned in Texas. I argued that true national reconciliation would not only require the legal purpose of slavery, but also official recognition of the injustices committed and genuine efforts to repair the damage caused. We cannot simply declare that the past is dead and buried, I wrote to President Johnson. As I learned in my experiences in Texas, the past is never really dead, just awaits the right time to resurface. If we want lasting peace, we must honestly face the sins of our national history. Unfortunately, few leaders were willing to hear such advice. The Reconstruction was inadequately conducted, and the nation's racial wounds remained open for generations. Sometimes, I wonder if a different approach, one that recognized the spiritual and psychological dimension of historical trauma, could have led to a genuine healing. In my last years, I received regular letters from visitors from the Balcones. The area had become a kind of pilgrimage place for people interested in supernatural phenomena, but also for those seeking inspiration on how to confront historical injustices in their own communities. A particularly touching letter came from a young lawyer named Thomas B. Gay, a member of the Navajo Nation, who had visited the Tonkawa Memorial while studying right in the East. General Houston, he wrote, his work in the Balcones Hills gave us hope that injustices against my people can one day be recognized and approached. The Lord proved that it is possible for white men in positions of choosing justice on political convenience. This inspires me to continue fighting for the rights of my tribe, even when chances seem impossible. Letters like this reminded me that the events in the Balcones Hills had been more than just resolving a local haunt. They had established a precedent, shown that it was possible to confront the injustices of the past in a constructive way. In 1863, a few months before my death, I made a last pilgrimage to the Balcones Hills. I was old and weak, but I felt that I needed to return once again where I had learned some of the most important lessons of my life. The Tonkawa Memorial had become an even more exuberant garden. Generations of visitors had planted native flowers and trees, creating a place of serene beauty that contrasted strongly with the violence of its history. A small library had been built nearby, where researchers could study documents related to Tonkawa and other tribes in the region. I sat next to the memorial as the sun was reflected on everything that had happened since that first terrifying night. When I heard the spectral drums, the transformation was remarkable. A place of horror had become a symbol of hope, an example of how truth and justice could triumph over forgetfulness and denial. That final night, I saw no heart of stone again, but I felt his presence, as well as the presence of all the other Tonkawa who had finally found peace. And more than that, I felt the presence of something larger, a force that connected all the struggles for justice, all the silenced voices that eventually find a way of being heard. When I last left the Balcones hills, I took me the certainty that the work we had started there would continue. Other voices would rise, other injustices would be exposed, other communities would find ways to heal the wounds of their past. My story about the ghost tribe of Balcones Hills comes to an end, but the lessons she teaches are eternal. Everywhere where injustices have been committed and then forgotten, restless spirits await recognition. In every land stained by innocent blood, the earth itself calls for justice. During my long life as a soldier, politician, and leader, I learned that true courage is not in gaining external enemies, but in confronting the ghosts of our own past. It is easy to be brave on the battlefield, where the enemy is clearly in sight. It is much harder to show courage when the enemy is our own comfortable lies, our own reluctance to admit that we make mistakes. The Tonkawa taught me that the story is not just a sequence of events that happened and ended. History is a living force that continues to shape the present. The unresolved injustices of the past become the curses of the present. Buried truths always find a way to resurface. But I also learned that it is never too late to do what is right. Even decades after the massacre, it was still possible to honor the dead, expose the truth, and bring some measure of justice. The land that had been cursed by injustice was transformed into a place of healing and beauty. If this story has aroused something to you, a curiosity about the forgotten injustices of your own region, a determination to investigate the inconvenient truths of your own family or community history, or simply a renewed appreciation for the power of truth about convenience, so my mission has been fulfilled. The ghosts of the Balcones Hills have finally found their peace, but there are many other restless spirits waiting for someone brave enough to hear their stories. Perhaps you are the next to answer this call. Remember, wherever you step on Texas, you walk on sacred land, stained by the blood of innocent, but also blessed by the spirits of those who fought for justice. Treat this land with respect. Honor your full story, not just the convenient parts. And if they ever hear ghostly drums echoing through the hills, or see spectral figures walking between the trees, do not run away. Stop. Listen. Perhaps you are exactly the person these spirits were, waiting to tell your story to the world. Truth always finds a way of emerging. The only question is if we will have enough courage to be your messengers. If these dark Texas stories and your hidden truths played you in some way, your curiosity has aroused about the mysteries that still await revelation in our lands, then subscribe to this channel. There are many other stories to tell, many other ghosts waiting to speak, many other injustices crying out for recognition. Together we can guarantee that the silenced voices of the past are never forgotten. Together we can honor those who came before us, bravely facing the truths others prefer to bury. The story of Texas is far from complete, and you can be part of writing the next chapters.